If you've ever wondered how a 3-metre guardrail arrives in the post, then here's your answer. So it arrives in an MDF and plywood packing case, something that I didn't know when I ordered it a few weeks back. So this video isn't going to be about why I've bought a 3-metre guide rail and why you should too, because the chances are you probably don't. Most people will get away with having 2 1.5-metre guide rails and a decent set of joining bars for pretty much all of their long sheet good ripping requirements. You can even get away with not actually having 2 joined rails for that length of cut in any case. Maybe something I'll cover in another video. But I have an outdoor cutting area and this is going to save me a lot of time on a couple of projects coming up. I paid around £100 for it from Elson Tools, and there was delivery on top because of the length was a bit extra. But I'm really happy with the price and this is going to save a lot of time. But this is an opportunity for me to revisit a video that I made a couple of years ago when I trimmed back to the splinter guard on a rail. Now that's one of my most popular videos. It's also where I showed the wayside jigs that I make for the first time, and they've been a huge success. And if you haven't got yours, then check out the link below. But that video doesn't include all of the tips that I would now recommend when setting up a guide rail for the first time, and we're going to cover that today. Tip number 1. When cutting your splinter guard for the first time, make sure that you're cutting into some material. The splinter guard needs to be supported from behind for best results, and I'm going to be using the case that this thing was delivered in as my sacrificial surface. For that initial trim cut, you should cut 2 to 3 millimeters into the sacrificial surface. That's 8 millimeters, considering the rail is 5 millimeters thick. Here I'm using the original Strawbyte depth stop indicator for Makita Saws. More on that at the end of the video. Tip number 2 is about making sure that the saw is set up correctly and it's set up on the rail. You need to remove as much play as you can by adjusting the cams on the back of the saw. Each saw has its own mechanism, it's all roughly the same, and you really just tighten them up until it's too tight and the saw won't move. You back it off a little. Another thing to check while you're at it is to make sure that the blade is square to the base plate of the saw. Having done all that, let's make the first cut. So tip number 3 is to ensure that the cams are fully engaged on the rib on the rail to stop there being excessive play at the start of the cut. If you look underneath the saw, you'll see where the cam and the saw base makes contact with the rib on the rail. It's always a good idea to rehearse cuts. It helps with body position and allows you to check that hoses and cords won't snag. And of course, don't forget to turn your dust extraction on. Close up we can see the trimmed back splinter guard. The edge of the rubber represents the edge of the kerf cut, and we'll use that as a reference for cuts in the future. So in my earlier video, people got carried away in the comments about what to do about this little piece of the splinter guard which doesn't get cut when you plunge your saw whilst it's firmly on the rail. Now of course when you come to use your rail, you need to align the splinter guard up against some marks on your workpiece. You won't be starting your cut with the saw in any other position than properly on the rail, so realistically speaking you're going to be lining up against a mark which is a bit further up the rail here, so this really isn't going to be used for alignment at all. One thing that I do now, and this is really tip number 4, is once I've made my first cut on a new rail with the saw correctly seated, then I will mark with a Sharpie where that point is and indicate that it is between that mark and one at the other end that I will be aligning to my marks. And the other thing that I'll do on the rail is mark up the position on the rail where the cams are engaged. Then I can see at a glance that the saw is properly seated on the rail. Now you can take this a step further by transferring onto the rail the limits of your saw's cut at full depth. This is because the blade, when lowered fully, extends a little bit further along the rail towards its ends than that initial trim cut did. This is a tip that I picked up from the tool Carpenter. He explains it incredibly well in a video which I'll link to in the description. You can reduce that little nubbin on the end to about 20 millimeters. This is a rail that I trimmed back a couple of weeks ago, and you know what? I tend to just leave this little nubbin here. Answers a couple of questions from the comments before. So clearly the simplest way of dealing with those untrimmed ends is to join another rail to the new rail and then run the saw through and trim that end back. I'm using joining bars from Festool in this case. That's a premium option. Makita do make their own and they are much cheaper, but remember you will need to buy two, one to join on the top side of the rail and one to join on the underside of the rail. So having cut a fresh edge on our splinter guard, you may well be thinking that that's it, it's a one and done situation, but actually that edge will degrade over time, it will wear, it will pick up little nicks. Ultimately it will stop becoming the reference edge that it once was, in which case then you need to replace it, and fresh splinter guard material is available in rolls like this. This is from Makita, it's 3 meters long and comes in at around £10. Applying it's really easy. You can remove the old splinter guard with a hot air gun on a low heat or hairdryer, that's what I tend to use. And if the old tape doesn't come off with the splinter guard, then a little heat and a scraper will get it off fairly easily. And then with its self-adhesive backing, essentially you just put the new splinter guard down in its place, and then you can go ahead and cut a fresh edge in the same way that I've shown you today. Festool make their own, which of course is clear. This is actually 3 times the cost of the Makita splinter guard, and to be honest I've had great success in using this on all of my Festool rails as well, and it's actually a little bit easier to align the edge of a rail to a pencil mark with a black splinter guard anyway, so you might find that useful too. But like I promised, let's take another look at the saw and look at that depth stop indicator. So on Makita saws, this black indicator with the orange arrow is to indicate the depth of plunge cut with the saw not on the rail. So if you need to, for example here, set the depth on the rail at 18 millimeters, then you need to add another 5 millimeters on to the indicator. So you really need to be setting this at 23 millimeters. There we go. And so I came up with this as a way of really replicating something very similar that you'll see on Festool saws, so that we can accurately set the depth whilst the saw is on the rail. And there's a further indicator on the piece of plastic that you add in, which shows you a cut of the depth that you require, plus 3 millimeters into the surface below. Most MFT style tables recommend for clean cuts that you cut a little way into the underlying bench. If I change that now, there we go. So that's 18 millimeters and cutting 3 millimeters into the bench. And this is revision 9 and goes on sale along with this video. Check the link out in the description for the listing on my website and Etsy. The indicator is easy to install and comes with full instructions. With the stock indicator removed, you insert this over the 3 prongs like that, reattach the spring and then reinstall it onto the saw. There we go. And that will give you the full range of movement through the quadrant. So remember, this edge without the rail, this edge with the rail, this edge to cut 3 millimeters into the material below. So the depth stop indicator was an original idea of mine back in 2019, and since 2020 I've sold thousands of them. So there are thousands of saws that can now accurately set their depth whilst on the rail. And if you want to pick up a set for yourself, including instructions, then check out the link that takes you to my website. It's a great way to support the channel and the work that I do in my workshop. Anyway, stay tuned. I perhaps may revisit track saws again in the very near future, but for now, cheerio. That'll do.